Pharyngist and sarcoma patient organization, Sarcoma. Thank you for joining us to this session dedicated to one of the most ambitious and challenging topics many patient organizations have to face, which is patient involvement in clinical research. Indeed, when we start a patient organization, this is clearly a goal we all have in mind, but sometimes, despite our high needs and determination, we just don't know if we will be able to do it, how to do it, what to do for it, and what shape it is supposed to take. So I'm strongly convinced that the three brilliant speakers that will share with you their views and experience on this burning topic within the next 60 minutes will not only provide you precious clues, but will also show you that there are indeed many ways to be involved in it, and that finally anyone can reach this goal regardless the size and the means of the organizations. So before giving the floor to Markus for the introduction, I just have to remind you that I am not only the chair of the session, but I am also, unfortunately, the timekeeper. So as we would like to respect the schedule, I kindly ask you not to interrupt our speakers during their talks as much as possible, and keep your questions for the discussion panel that will be held at the end of the session. However, if you have a very burning question you're afraid to forget, please send it to that chat so as our team can recall it during the discussion. Having said that, Markus, I think it's your turn now.
Thank you, Estelle. Just sharing my screen. So my role today is to give you really a basic introduction into patient involvement in clinical research. So the question is, why should patients and how can patient advocates be more involved in clinical research? So we are starting just in a very early beginning. So let's move forward with the first slide. If we talk about sarcomas, sarcomas, as you all know, they are part of so-called rare cancers, and Sarcoma Patients Euronet is now very much engaged for more than 10 years in a European network called Rare Cancers Europe. And the problems or the challenges we are facing in sarcomas are not the problems or challenges just only in sarcomas, but many other types of rare cancers, such as neuroendocrine tumors, head and neck tumors, and a lot of different other groups. They face the same challenges, mainly because of the rarity. And this is a slide from our colleague, Kathy Oliver from IBTA, that's the Brain Tumor Alliance. And these are some of the challenges of rare cancer. So it's about prevention and screening, very often late and incorrect diagnosis, lack of information, widespread, and so on. Many of you are aware of these challenges of rare cancers. If we have a closer look to these challenges, a lot of these challenges, they have to do directly or indirectly with deficits in cancer research. So it's about widespread small populations of patients. And remember about our field of sarcomas, when you go to the WHO classification, we are talking about 175 different diagnoses. So sometimes you have very small groups of patients, and the question is, can we do research for these patients, for these small groups of patients? But also a shortage of local medical expertise. So the question is always, who is offering or is doing these kind of clinical trials? Very often we have incomplete, or in some countries don't have sarcoma registries and tissue banks. Then sometimes we have methodological barriers, depends on how clinical trials are designed. We have not enough clinical trials specifically for rare cancers, regulatory barriers, and a lot of different other issues. Maybe just going back, one of the major problems we face is the survival, because when you compare the survival of rare cancers with common cancers, you see that the survival rate is quite much lower than the survival rate of patients with common cancer. So there are a lot of deficits, and part of these deficits are based on cancer research, or in this case, sarcoma research. So the question is, why should patients be involved in clinical research, and why should patient advocates be interested in? So the first of all is, and this is the basic issue, is that the meaning of medicine and healthcare is to support and to benefit people. So patients and relatives, they should be the focus. They are the real customers. And I think that's a very, very big difference to many other industries. When you go to other industries, very often the customer is really in the focus. That means customers are part of the developing process. For example, if you buy a new car or whatever you do, the car companies, they talk to the customers quite very, very early in the process, in the research process. But looking to drug development processes and other research processes in cancer, we still have a lack of communication, early communication and early involvement with the real, let's call them customers, means we don't have very often the involvement, the early involvement of patients into the process. And we should be aware of the fact that everyone can be a patient and a relative tomorrow. Also doctors, researchers, politicians can be patients tomorrow. Sometimes when you listen to all these discussions, you get the impression if officials talk about patients, sometimes they talk about patients like aliens. This is the totally wrong approach, because as I mentioned before, everyone can be a patient tomorrow, a relative can be a patient tomorrow. So also doctors and researchers, politicians should be interested in. Patients are a cross-section through our society. So patients are not a specific group. They are indeed a cross-section. Something like a mirror of our societies. And last but not least, patients are citizens, they are voters, they are taxpayers, they are contributors. And that's very clear. We have the right to be involved, to be listened to, especially if other people are making decisions about us, or if they make decisions about patients. The next area is patients bear the ultimate risk of clinical trials, the risk for their lives. And I think this is one of the major issues, specifically in diseases like cancer. We are talking about, as you all know, life-threatening diseases. So the patients bear the risk to be part of the clinical trial when it comes to new drugs in clinical trials. When it comes to wrong research questions, the patients have to take the consequences if there are wrong research questions, or if there is an inappropriate study design, the patients have to bear or have to carry the risk. But also missing insufficient information, delays in research, and a lot of different other issues. So I think that's the second part. And the third part, as we all know, patients know best what it means to have a specific diagnosis or to live with a specific condition. So it is absolutely clear patients are the real experts living with a specific disease. They know exactly what does it mean to live with a disease. And what we also learned over many, many years is that very often the views of doctors and patients can differ. So doctors can have a totally different view or a totally different perspective. So it's very important to bring the patient's perspective into the room. And specifically in rare cancers, patients very often know more than their doctors. And also the patient groups have access to very first source of information, the patients and the relatives. So very often patient groups, they have an overview what's going on in a specific disease, what are the challenges of a specific group of patients. And what we also see coming up now is the new field, or the upcoming field, of so-called personalized medicine or precision oncology. That means cancer or a diagnosis is becoming much more individual. So we are not talking about having a liver cancer or having a colon cancer or having a breast cancer. We are talking about several subtypes, for example, in breast cancer or in colon cancer. And we also, if we look into the subtypes of these kind of diseases, we also see within a specific subtype, we see very individual situations of patients. So because it's getting more and more personalized, it is a must to involve patients much more into the process. And what we also see, there's an increasing criticism of the old study system. So when you move through all the to the literature and different articles and different comments, but also conferences, very often the focus on the patient is often ignored or is neglected. Very often we see results of clinical trials that are often far away from real life and real needs, because very often clinical trials are specific situations, they are cleaned situations, they are lab situations more or less, and have very often the situation in real life is quite very different than in a specific clinical trial. Remember our experiences in GIST, for example. We have seen GIST therapies coming into approval with a certain dosing and a certain dosing schedule. But now, several years after the approval, we use these kind of therapies partly in a very different way with different dosing schedules, because we learned a lot from real life and real needs. There are some estimation or some evaluations that there are over 1 million studies published, and some experts really complain that 85% of all studies are useless or waste of money. Another issue is that we see a lot of resources that are spent within medical research is to double efforts to do things right instead of doing the right thing. So we are investing a lot of money to do a second trial and a third trial to get more evidence, to get better evidence, to confirm this and confirm that. And a lot of money and a lot of resources are going into these kind of directions. We also see challenges with clinical trials in rare cancers, and this is very much based on evidence, because and this is the term of rare cancers. If you have a condition that is quite rare, it is much more difficult to build clinical evidence. In many of these rare cancer types, you can't do phase 3 clinical trial with 300 patients around the world, because it's not possible, because you will not be able to find the patients, or it will take you years to get all the patients together in one trial. So there are things that are really very challenging, specifically in rare cancers. Very often, and this is also ongoing, we see more and more gaps between approval and HTA, because trials are designed, or the concept of clinical trials very often are done, the concept or the setup of a clinical trial is very often from a scientific perspective in the direction of approval for FDA and EMA. But then very often, and you all know this specifically in Europe, approval is one part of the coin, and the other part of the coin is reimbursement. And as we all know, the reimbursement situation, called HTA, the Health Technology Assessment, is quite very different from country to country. And so different countries might have different criteria in evaluating a specific therapy, and also reimburse a specific therapy. And as we just also discussed, it is evident that cancer is now, it's becoming more and more a very individual disease, and personalized oncology, or as others named it, precision oncology, is the future. So we need better concept to do target-oriented research, to do better research and faster research. So that's our way forward. So currently in many countries, a lot of patients, they participate in clinical trials. They are more or less subjects of clinical trials. We see more and more that there is somewhere an engagement of patient groups in the field of clinical trials. So patient groups are working more and more closely together with medical experts to disseminate the information about clinical trials, but also information, maybe the results, and maybe sometimes they are also involved in informed consent and a lot of different other issues. There is a trend, and this is very different from country to country, where patient experts are more and more early actively involved in studies and research projects. And as I mentioned before, Sorry, this is different from country to country. So for example, the UK, they are several years ahead in front of other countries, like for example, Germany. We are in a very early beginning now to do patient involvement in clinical research compared to other countries. And what we hope to achieve within the next years is more a partnership, so that patients become research partners, and that patients and experts, researchers are really working closer together when it comes to clinical research. So our objective is to get better research, faster research, more efficient, more meaningful research, as I mentioned before, closer to real life, to real needs. But also, as we know, in many countries, and Germany, unfortunately, is one of the countries where we are experiencing a lot of burden and bureaucracy if it comes to clinical trials. So we also need to work together with our medical colleagues to lower the burden and to lower these bureaucracy when it comes to clinical trials, for example. Data protection and a lot of these issues are real issues when it comes to clinical trials. So that's our goal, to be better research partners in the future. So this is a very simple example how patients are helping to find answers. So this is a patient, her name is Anne, just an example, and she is an expert about her disease. She learned a lot during the last years about her disease. And now, but she also learned that there are still knowledge gaps in her disease. And so she learned that very often that research results do not often or can't often answer the real questions, so that a lot of questions might be open and could be better answered by research if patients are involved in the process. So Anne wants to help. So she is motivated to be part of a research group and help medical professionals and researchers to understand better what are the patient priorities, what are the patient wishes, maybe to do a better research and maybe come up and with better answers to open questions in the research process. This is a very simple process, and you can find these processes very often. And we will hear also a little bit later from our colleague Roger, who has followed the whole way during the last 15 to 20 years. He also started as an expert patient, and in the meantime, he is a real expert in the whole sarcoma research process. The next example is the patient or the drug development process. And following the whole drug development process, there are several opportunities where it really makes sense to involve patients. Sometimes in a very early beginning, so that researchers can understand better what does it mean to live with such a specific disease, what are the challenges, what are the problems, what are the needs of the patients. But also when you follow then the drug development process, there are certain steps within the drug development process where you need also different qualifications of patient representatives. For example, when it comes to the trial design and the planning, you need patient advocates who have some experience in how to design clinical trials and how to work, for example, with endpoints of clinical trials, with inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria, and different other questions. So that means we also need different level of knowledge of patients and patient advocates who are integrated or who are involved in the whole process. So this is my last slide, and this is some aspects for patient organizations and what does patient involvement mean or in clinical cancer research means. It is an enormous opportunity for change because, as we have learned in a very early beginning or have heard in a very early beginning, there are a lot of issues that are really show deficits in rare cancers that are based on deficits in cancer research or sarcoma research. So this is a great opportunity for change. It is important to understand how research works and which language is spoken in research. So that means patients need training. So they need training to understand the research process better, to understand clinical trials, and so that they really are able to understand the language and really can talk to the researchers. They need to understand how research in your country and your disease is organized, because it can be organized different from country to country, but it could be also organized maybe different from disease to disease. It is important to have a peer-to-peer cooperation with experts and researching companies and other stakeholders. So you need to build up relationships with these different groups. And it is about really to be a partner in the research process. It's not the idea that patients now suddenly become researchers. That's not the idea. It's to be a partner, to bring in the patient's perspective, the needs, the priorities into the research process. It is about to prepare your organization to be part of the research process, so that your organization is prepared maybe to be part of a clinical trial in the design phase of a clinical trial. It's to analyze and define what are the gaps in your disease, should be research priorities. And you can imagine if we look to sarcomas in a whole, so we are talking about so many different diagnoses, and the research priorities and maybe the needs, the gaps in research priorities could be different from sarcoma subtype to sarcoma subtype. In general, we need a changing mindset, and that this topic is a core success factor for research. And this is important to convince researchers that this is a very valuable topic to bring the patient's voice as early as possible into the process. And this is not just a nice PR idea, or maybe that patients feel themselves more important because they are part of the process. It is important to understand that countries are differently developed on this topic. As I mentioned before, UK has a history in the cancer for more than 20 years now, and other countries are in a very early beginning. And maybe to make some progress in your country, maybe it is important to unite with other patient organizations to make a general progress on the topic. Maybe on one side, it's important to make progress in sarcoma research, but maybe it is helpful to make a first step to change the situation more in general, to involve patients earlier into the research process. So this was the basic introduction to the process. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Markus, for this very complete and comprehensive presentation. Unless we have burning questions now, we will turn to Roger.
Thank you, Estelle.
Oh,
I'm here, yeah.
So I think you're going to present an inspirational experience from the UK.
Yes. Well, I don't want to do the same, obviously, as Markus. He's doing a lot about the how and the why and the wherefore. I'm going much more into the, if you like, the philosophical side, the emotional side, the business of actually having done it and what it's meant.
Okay, so it's a life experience.
Yes, the user experience. So shall I charge away?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, thank you. Patient involvement is actually a very simple concept. It's about getting the views and experiences of patients and carers who have the lived experience, whether they're living or, in the case of carers, their loved ones who've now gone, but who have the lived experience of cancer. And it's getting that experience in front of decision makers and then empowering them to take part in the decision making about cancer treatments and the services which support cancer patients. I'm not going to use any slides, so if you want to close your eyes because you don't want to look at me, that's fine. I think patient involvement is critical to the professional's understanding of what can and can't be done in developing better treatments and services for patients. And I think there are also strong moral and ethical issues involved, and we might get into some of those in questions and discussion later. But it's important to recognize that regulators, as well as scientists and clinical researchers, are learning to value patient input. More and more of this whole body of to get high quality evidence and then to use it effectively. Now, I think there's a question lurking in the back of this. Is patient involvement different from patient advocacy? Well, I think it is. You can be an effective advocate without being a patient. And you can be an effective involved patient without having to use the skills or the tools that an advocate might use. The power of the advocate is in their ability to gather and present evidence, part of which may be the user experience brought in by patients. And the power of the involved cancer patient is the lived experience. It is in the truth of their story, the drama, if you like, of what they've been through, the nakedness of the reality of being a patient. The patient who is also an advocate, therefore, has an important place. But as I know only too well, when you do both roles, you need to have contact with other patients to ensure that the whole story of the cancer experience can be told as powerfully as you can do it. Now, to do all this, we need to build relationships, principally with our professional partners, so that these stories have the opportunity to come through. I think this partnership has been one of SPAEN's strengths, and we need to build on that. Now, as patients, we must recognize that we're going into their world. We must respect that. It is their world. We may wish to change it, but it is their world. So our behavior as patients must be appropriate. We must behave professionally, but we mustn't lose the integrity of being a patient. So let's just have a think for a moment or two what that means. The best relationships are built on respect, transparency, honesty, open-mindedness, generosity. We need to show that we are rational. While sometimes at the right moment, it does no harm to be a bit emotional. And we need to understand evidence and to use it in the appropriate way. We must not be overawed by those we meet, however eminent they may be. We must be prepared to talk openly about our experiences, the good as well as the bad, and to respond to questions, but not to keep repeating ourselves. We must be ready to listen, to understand, and to ask questions to make sure that we do understand. We must be prepared to recognize that a decision may not be what we want. We should see every decision as a positive step along the road, not as a final position. And we must always be polite and courteous, even when disagreeing with someone or with something which has been put forward. I went to my first meeting as a patient at my local hospital just about 20 years ago. The surgeon who chaired that meeting cut my leg off 6 years later. I still know him. I got to meet more people with greater influence and to work internationally. We've done some effective things together in partnership. We've made things, I hope, better for patients. It's a process which takes time. I've learned that we achieve more by moving steadily than by seeking spectacular wins from day one. The spectacular win is wonderful. You may get into the newspapers, who knows? But it is often not sustainable. It may not be based on solid ground. A small step can be more easily consolidated and built upon. And then you go for the next step. And sometimes we can achieve a lot by being subtle. Let the professionals realize something and encourage them when they move to do it. We told them about it in a previous meeting. They think they've thought of it for themselves. So let's take a look at the English experience of cancer patient involvement, which, as Markus said, is probably now one of the more extensive examples there is. It isn't alone. There are others who've done really good things, and they've done them differently, but just as effectively. I'd certainly highlight Canada in that context. So my experience is just one example. We set up the National Cancer Research Institute in 2001. It's not a building. I suppose you'd call it a virtual institute. It's a partnership of 20 or more organisations which fund cancer research, and it includes the government, not just the national UK government, but the devolved governments in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland. And that political commitment is an important one. Patient involvement in cancer had actually started a few years earlier. Existing structures from funding charities, research funding charities, were taken over, and there were already patients working in them. I joined this group in 2002. We formed a collaborative patient group so that we could share experiences, develop collective ideas, and look at how we equipped ourselves to do it better. In the first meeting I went to, there were 14 patients, and there were 18 disease-specific groups in the NCRI, in the Institute, but only 10 of them had patients in them. But we also had a seat on the board of the organisation and on the advisory committee, which worked with the executive. And 2 patients worked with the executive team of the National Cancer Research Network, which was building the structures within UK hospitals, including patient involvement in those structures, to enable clinical trials to take place. By 2005, so that's 4 years on, we had doubled the number of clinical trials taking place in the UK. And we had more than doubled the number of patients entering clinical studies. By 2007, we actually recruited more patients into cancer research studies of all kinds from a population of 67 million than the USA did from a population of 312 million. Now that took political will, backed up by money, and importantly, the involvement of patients. It is acknowledged now that without the involvement of patients, the money would not have been as effectively spent. There would have been fewer studies, and studies would not have recruited patients as quickly. We were involved with everything by then, and we still are. The NCRI's Consumer Forum is a reservoir of trained patients. Today, there are well over 100 in contact, and there are plenty of others now who've been through the forum, but are no longer associated with it. Each one of those patients has a focus on a specific disease, the one they experienced themselves. And they can get to know quite a lot about it. Each of them is also able to offer a viewpoint, which brings in a wider perspective because they know and work with other patients. I've done a lot of work with patients with lung cancer, for example. So I would never claim to be an expert on it, but I do know quite a lot about it. So the National Cancer Research Institute now has disease research groups. It has cross-cutting groups looking at research areas such as radiotherapy and pathology and psychosocial care. It has groups aimed at empowering researchers and educating them. It has task groups with specific objectives, and all of them have patients as core members. There are also patient-led meetings, such as Dragon's Den, which brings researchers with an early idea into consultation with a panel of patients, maybe for just half an hour. We hold these at least 3 times a year, and they're in demand. People want to have the experience of talking to a group of patients with a wide perspective, as well as the narrow perspective of a specific cancer. The NCRI also accredits academic teams providing methodology and statistical skills, and there are patients involved with them too. I do a certain amount of work with the Clinical Trials Unit, as it's called, at Birmingham. A nice gang of people, and I'm very welcomed there. Now let's just for a moment look at the NCRI's Sarcoma Research Group. There are now 3 patients in the group. I think all of them are here today. I'm also there, but I'm strangely no longer there strictly as a patient, but let's not go into that. We'll leave that to one side. The group's brief is to bring forward, review, and support clinical research and trials, to review and identify opportunities in scientific research, and to work with other groups where collaboration to address sarcoma patient needs can be identified. That's a relatively recent part of the brief, but an important one. I think a cultural change has happened in the UK over recent years. Our researchers, scientists and doctors are now thinking patient rather than thinking disease. They have learnt that a patient is not a disease on legs, but a real person. Patients sit in meetings and complain about the heating. They drink coffee. They like a biscuit. They have careers and families, and they can talk about cooking, football, whatever you like. We all knew that. We knew we could do it. They just hadn't caught on. So that's the cultural change, which I think patient involvement can bring. And it's a change that I would like to see happen throughout cancer research in every country. We've started, and I want to see it accelerate. I've been working with the EORTC over the last couple of years, and they've now made a very striking commitment to patient involvement, although we still don't really know how best to do it. When I first went to an EORTC soft tissue and bone sarcoma group meeting about 10 years ago, I was an intruder. Not now. Patients go to its meetings and they get consulted. It's still hard work, let's be honest about that. But there has been a subtle change in the sarcoma community, which is happening internationally, helped, I have to say, by some truly visionary doctors and researchers. Now we need more patients to do it. We need patients who can speak out. We need to see them invited to join research groups in local hospitals, in regions, in countries. We've got pharma taking steps in this direction. Most drug research is funded by pharma, but they are finding sarcoma patients difficult to find. If Spain had access through national patient organizations to patients willing to share their experience, we could tell pharma and industry, make these patients available to them, to advise them. We could also tell healthcare regulators and governments. EMA already consults patients. We need more sarcoma patients to be ready to undertake work with them. I think we have had to find one patient a year over the last 3 or 4 years. And as more trials hopefully come on with the growth of studies in sarcoma, we're going to need more. National regulators may need more persuading, but governments can do that. So we must target the governments too. Insurers, however, are very numbers-driven people, and there is, as far as I'm aware, no direct patient involvement with either state-backed or commercial insurers anywhere in Europe at the moment. There could be. I hope someone will make that happen. So we need patients to join research funding committees, to be involved in ethical review, to be peer reviewers for scientific papers, to support our researchers, and to help regulators do the right job. Some of this work will be at an international level. Some opportunities, and hopefully increasingly, will be at a national level. The national advocacy group members of SPAEN would be a natural focus for this to happen. But we know it could be a challenge, and we want to help resolve that. So I hope I've got you excited about the idea of patient involvement. Estelle.
Are you finished?
I have finished, yes, over to you.
Oh, sorry.
With you, Mum. It's all right.
I was watching you on the Facebook Live. Okay.
I don't do Facebook.
Oh. So thank you very much for this very inspiring presentation. I like the fact that you stressed that a patient advocate was different from a patient involved in clinical research, and that you didn't need necessarily to be a patient advocate to be involved in research. And I think it is a very important point, because many people wonder if they would be legitimate to do it. And so I think it was an important detail. And I also like the fact that you stress the importance of building relationships with people around, patients, organizations, and of course, physicians. Because it's an important, sorry, I missed my word.
It's what you've done in France so effectively,
yeah.
You know, working with the teams in Paris and with Professor.
Yes, and I also face the same difficulties, and I'm still facing very, a lot of challenges, because sometimes I have the impression that things are stepping back a little. So you have the impression that it's a constant hard work. So thank you for sharing this experience. And I guess our guests also have the same opinion. Okay, no burning question at that stage. Okay, so now we come to our last.
I think there's
one question. Sorry, I didn't say.
From Anna.
Anna?
Yes, I'm here.
Oh.
Hello, I just wanted to comment on Roger's presentation. I totally agree with you, Roger, with everything you said, and you said it beautifully, as usual, with a lot of your words make a lot of sense.
Thank you.
Having said that, I think that there are two main problems. One is the willingness from cancer centers to accept patients, because you see, when I was in charge of the Italian GIST group, and that was back at least 7 or 8 years ago, when I offered to enter the ethical committee in the National Cancer Center, and I was supported in that by Dr. Casali. So I was in full, in a beautiful position. And I participated into one committee. And after that, the ethical committee refused my presence for the rest of the time coming, because they objected that there was already a patient representative in the committee. And in fact, there was a lady who is involved she was involved in breast cancer. Of course, she had no experience, no knowledge in sarcoma or in other cancers, but for the ethics committee, that was enough, because patients were represented. So this is an issue that probably a single patient or a single organization cannot win. Maybe we can think of some steps on the side of SPAEN as a federation. There must be some power to speak to cancer centers and to convince them with your presentation, because you, Roger, spoke beautifully. I mean, these things should be said to cancer centers. And the second big problems that I still meet with trials is the informed consent. In my experience, it is a thick 20, 25 or 30 pages of legal language that no patient can understand, and everybody signs it, and nobody understands, and doctors, oncologists, even in good faith, they have no time to explain everything.
Well, they can't explain it.
Yeah.
I agree with you on both those issues, Anna. I think the informed consent one is one that is going to roll and roll and roll, because unfortunately, of course, the lawyers have a voice in it. And when that happens, it just rolls and rolls. But we will get there eventually. On the issue of representation, I think the important thing is that patient groups must come together. This is what we're doing in Europe. You know, we have the WeCan Confederation, which is organizations like SPAEN, but in other disease areas. And we have an association of associations, which are associations of associations. But WeCan gives us a collective voice. Mm-hmm. Now, we need to be able to do that, nationally. Now, we've got that in the UK with our consumer forum at the National Cancer Research Institute. And we had the benefit of having funding and political backing to make it happen. So one of the things you need to do, I think, is get together with other patient groups and look at how you might move that collectiveness forward together, because you can't do, in a thing like an ethics committee, you can't do individual representation of an individual cancer. It's just not practical. But what you need to do is to have a representative there who understands a wide range of cancer patient situations, even just very superficially, but they do have an understanding. They mustn't just focus on their own one experience.
Okay,
so,
thank you. So we move to the next presentation, and we'll come back to this discussion because I also have personal comments to add to what Anna just said. So welcome, Gerard. Are you here?
Yes, I'm here.
So our friends from the Netherlands will present the findings from the International Sarcoma Priority Setting Partnership Surveys. A great experience.
Yes, I will share
your slides.
Okay.
That works. Perfect.
Do you see it?
Yes, yes.
Yes, okay. Okay, thank you. I think Markus and Roger very well explained the need and also the value of patient involvement in research. And we as SPAEN have for a long time been aware of the importance of this. And as a board, we have been thinking of how can we mobilize the lived experience, the wealth of experience of the patients, the large patient group in many countries that we as SPAEN represent. And in 2019, we were actually thinking about setting up a project to really mobilize the lived experience of all the patients in the various countries, but it was not very easy. And at that same time, when we were thinking of how can we do this, how can we really set up a questionnaire or something like that, we were approached by Winnet van der Graaf and Olga Husson from the Netherlands Cancer Institute. And they were thinking from the side of the researchers, of the medical professionals, about the same topic. How can we involve patients? And Winnet had the idea to set up what is called a patient-powered research partnership. So this was an excellent opportunity. We had a meeting, and very soon we decided, let's join forces. We will collaborate and set up a project. So Olga gave a first presentation a year ago at our meeting in Milan. Some of you may remember that. And in the meantime, we have progressed, and I will give you now the state of affairs. The presentation has been prepared by Olga and myself, and Olga was going to, the plan was that Olga would give the presentation, but unfortunately the timing was not very good for her. So I will do the presentation. Well, why we did this has been explained already, so we don't have to talk about this. We started the project in 2019. We formed an advisory group with several representatives from member organizations of SPAEN. Together we defined a questionnaire, and also we looked at a process. How can we organize this? How can we
low-grade leiomyosarcoma? But
sorry, someone else is talking, or?
No, that's okay.
Oh, okay. How can we organize the project? So we have to define questions. We have to translate the questions. We have to take care that they are sent out in the various countries. So this was prepared by Olga and a few of her co-workers together with the advisory committee of SPAEN. And in 2019, the questionnaire was sent out, and in Milan, Olga has presented the first results. Actually, we were planning a two-phase process. In the first step, as I said, identify the questions, define the questions, send out a questionnaire, analyze the results. And this will give a long list of questions and topics that should be involved in future research agenda. But when you have a long list, you will need a second step, second phase, and send out another questionnaire to ask patients about the priorities. So the first step we have been performed. so in the first questionnaire that was sent out, the main questions were about what would you like to see answered by research in 6 different areas: diagnosis of sarcoma, treatments, treatment and treatments decisions, what kind of support is needed during the patient journey, health-related quality of life issues, a very important topic, survivorship question, the follow-up. Many patients will not be completely healed and will have a follow-up and will survive for several years. And what about this phase? What kind of research should be done for that phase? And if further treatment is no longer possible, we have to face end-of-life issues. And this may require research as well. This questionnaire was sent out in several countries. In total, 264 patients and carers have answered the questions. You see here the details of the respondents. I think we really had a good coverage of different types of patients and diseases. We got the results, and what came back was really large amount of questions for research. More than 1,000. The first analysis resulted in more than 1,000 different questions. And Olga, with her co-workers, has tried to come up with a clear result in terms of different topics, different sub-themes. But it was a huge amount and not very suitable for the second step to send out to come up with real priorities. It was clear that more analysis should be done at that time. But unfortunately, there was no capacity in the National Cancer Institute to do work on this. So we had discussions with Olga, how can we really further our work, and is it possible, would it be possible to collaborate with you from the patient side, with volunteers from SPAEN? And as a result, a small group of volunteers from our Dutch organization were available, and we decided to do a different type of analysis based on the so-called common scientific outline approach, which is often used in scientific research for cancers. This common scientific outline this is an example of how it's structured. There are 6 main topics: biology, etiology, prevention, early diagnosis, detection and prognosis, treatment, cancer control, survivorship, and outcomes. And all of these 6 main topics are subdivided in subtopics, as you can see in the right-hand side. An example of a couple of these sub-themes are given here. So we started with a small group, and among them were Paul van Kampen, who is also, I think, attending now, and Carlos Koops. He is one of our members. He is a patient himself, but also he happens to be a medical student. So and together with them, I joined them, and together as a small group, we have been working on this type of analysis. It was not always very easy. We sometimes thought, well, this is also not the ideal structure for doing this analysis of these replies of all the patients, but we were able to do it. So we have analyzed all the replies, and there were many, as I mentioned before. There were 6 main topics, and we had 274 replies. So there were many replies, many answers to be analyzed. What also became clear is that we asked for topics for research, but if you look at the replies and the answers, they are not all research topics. So we found out that there are mainly 3 categories. One, research questions, that is what we were looking for, but also there were a lot of questions which were actually requests for information, need for information. And in many cases, this is a need for information which actually is available. So this is, I think, very valuable for patient groups. If you know the need for information and the information is there, we can give the information to the patients. There was a 3rd category, and these were topics for advocacy. And this is also very valuable input for patient organizations, because it gives a kind of action agenda for us on which topics we should act to improve the situation for patients. Here you see a small example of results. The 3 categories: topic for advocacy. And the 2nd category is the real research questions. In this case, we see 2 research questions. How often do misdiagnoses occur in sarcoma patients? Now, this is something that can be found out. What is the difference between fibrosarcoma and osteosarcoma? This is a very detailed question, but also something that could be researched. And then examples of the need for information. And this is just one part of the results. In fact, we found in total around 60 research questions, 60 around about the same amount of topics for advocacy, and also about the same amount, 60, of primarily need for information. And now the 2nd step will have to be performed from now on. So we have to do some more research on what we have now, because 60 research questions is still a lot to send out in a questionnaire to patients and ask them to give the priority. We feel that maybe a list of 20 would be appropriate to present to the patients again and ask them to give their priority. So this is a next step that still has to be performed. But once we have done that, I think we will have a very valuable and nice input for the discussion with the researchers. These are the priorities of the patients, and how can we work together to get these topics addressed in research, and how can we further improve the involvement of patients in the research. At the same time, there is another activity where SPAEN is involved that was taking place, and that is the collaboration with the National Leiomyosarcoma Foundation in the United States and with a lot of sarcoma specialists and sarcoma researchers in the United States and in Europe. One of them is Bernd Kasper. I think he is also attending this session. He is also involved in this roundtable, the so-called roundtable for research. There was a meeting last year, and there are a number of working groups working in this roundtable to perform research, to improve the research for leiomyosarcoma. And Bernd Kasper has also was the leader for making a publication on the needs of the patients in leiomyosarcoma. And we have used the results of this questionnaire to contribute to this roundtable. Olga has made a subset of she took out the leiomyosarcoma patients' responses from the questionnaire, and we have used that to make a list of needs which are typical for leiomyosarcoma patients. And this has been input for the publication of the needs of patients. So these are examples of the results that we found for the leiomyosarcoma patients. Better support during entire patient journey, case management. Also, interesting question from patient is, what can I do myself in terms of lifestyle, in terms of food, exercise? Something that was also often mentioned by patients was the importance of peer support. And this is something that we all, as patient organizations, as a SPAEN, provide. So this is something that is really valued by the patients, I think. Quality of life is an important topic. How can I cope with being a sarcoma patient? How can I accept my disease? How can I accept the changes in my body? And sometimes if limbs have to be missed, how can I accept the changes in my body? Depression, anxiety, and emotions are very often mentioned as important aspects of quality of life, and patients ask for help to handle this, to manage the side effects of the treatment. Survivorship is also an important topic. How can we optimize the follow-up of patients? The interval for scans. You all know that scanxiety, so-called scanxiety, is something that many patients have to deal with. The anxiety for the next scan. Can we maybe change the interval for the scans a little bit without doing harm to the process of treatment? Late effects, if survival improves, people live longer, they are longer treated, and then we may have late effects of medication or other types of treatment. We have discussed that in a session yesterday, may be very, very important. Diets and what is called whole health care. Also mentioned several times by patients is, if I have to die, what will happen in the final phase? Can I die at home? also was mentioned the importance of giving information to the carers and the family so that they can provide adequate support to the patient. So the next steps, as I said before, we still have to do some additional analysis to come up with a limited set of research questions, so-called long list, that we can again send to the patients that took part in the questionnaire earlier, or even more patients. It would be nice if more patients would be involved in the questionnaire, to determine the priorities, the highest priorities that we then can discuss with the medical professionals and the researchers. So that is the state of affairs in this project. Are there questions?
Thank you, Gerard. It's been really an impressive work, and it seems that it is a never-ending process. I'm still very impressed by the number of questions that emerged from the survey, and I think we have worked for a lifetime and maybe over. So, do we have any questions from the audience? Oops, sorry.
Maybe just Estelle?
Yes.
Maybe just to make a comment, what we have heard so far, I think we have two main aspects. One aspect was presented now by Gerard, and this is very much based on our future strategy also in SPAEN, that we, at SPAEN, we have the idea not only to be involved in clinical research, but also to drive clinical research more in the future. I think that's one of the parts of our strategy. And many of you have heard that we are currently in a new strategy planning process, and I will report about this a little bit later during the AGM. But I think this is a wonderful example that we are very motivated at SPAEN to not just to be involved, but to drive the agenda. I think that's one issue. The other issue, what we have heard before in these two presentations, are also different, I would say, on a national level. From my own experience, we have built up a wonderful relationship from a very early beginning within the sarcoma community with our medical experts in the sarcoma community. And we have done wonderful projects, and we have been involved early into the clinical trial process by our colleagues. And in Germany, in the meantime, we have to build up a common organization called the German Sarcoma Foundation, where doctors and patients are working in one organization. We have one board together. So we are doing everything together in the future to fight against sarcoma. So this is one direction on a national level. But when I see the situation in Germany, when it comes to patient involvement in clinical research in Germany in general, it is really a nightmare. It makes me really sad to see how problematic this has been during the last 10, 15 years. Fortunately, we are now in a good situation in Germany to change this, because research landscape in Germany is changing, the cancer research landscape. And we have now a very strong voice within the cancer research landscape, but it will take, my feeling, another 5 to 10 years to change the whole situation within Germany. And I talked a lot with Roger about this, and I can remember one central sentence from our conversation, Roger. You mentioned the sentence, it is an evolution and not a revolution. So it will not happen overnight. So it will take time. It will take a strategy. It will take a lot of different activities to make things happen. And in Germany, what we currently see is that more and more patient advocates are now moving into the bigger cancer centers to be part of, let's call them patient advisory boards in cancer centers. This is the first step. This is not only focused on research, it's also focused on care and a lot of different other issues, but it is the first step to build up credibility and to build up a relationship with experts and with the centers to move forward. So on one side, it's our wish or our dream to make patient involvement in clinical research happen in general, but as I mentioned before, it will take time and it will need one step after the other by involving the cancer centers and build up relationships and build up trust. So that's my experience so far in the moment.
I would also like to share my personal experience because, as you know, I also have very good relationships with people from the French Sarcoma group for years now. And for years, I'm also sitting in various national committees, scientific advisory boards or patient advisory boards. And I found your slide with the chart showing the different steps of patient involvement in clinical research. You have participation, then you have engagement for the promotion. So these two steps are going okay because physicians always agree on the fact that they need patients to participate in the clinical trials. They also need patient organization to promote the clinical trials to improve the accrual of patients. And sometimes partnership can also be very easy if you bring fundings, but the step of patient involvement is really the critical phase, because you can have partnership, you can have participation or engagement, but involvement is really critical. And from my experience in the National Committee, for instance, I've been appointed 2 years ago to the National Committee, which appoint the heads of the regional cancer centers. So these people are appointed by the Ministry of Health. And so we represent the commission. There is an audition for these applicants. And I'm supposed to represent the patients in this committee. And really, it's not a positive experience for me. Because as Anna said, I'm the only patient representative around the table. And the problem is that when these people come to present their vision of the management of a cancer center, they are talking about science, they are talking about management, they are talking about budgets, but they are very rarely talking about patient involvement. And of course, my role in this commission is to challenge them on this topic. And most of the time, these people who are going to lead many of the biggest cancer centers in France have no idea of what patient involvement is supposed to be. And some people ignore that they have a patient advisory board in their cancer center. So they do not know what happens in it. And this is why I'm a bit skeptical about this patient board in cancer center. You say it can be a first step, but it depends on what they want to do with this committee, because sometimes it can just be an image. We have a patient committee in it, but finally they never challenge this committee with critical issues. And this is the hard work we have to do in the upcoming years. And my opinion is that when there is only a single patient representative around the table, it is an alibi, clearly. No matter the importance of this commission, if you are the only one, you can be sure that when you make, for instance, when I make a comment that I'm surprised this man who is going to lead a big cancer center has no idea about what patient representation should be. Sometimes the comments around the table is, okay, but he has a good scientific project. And the problem is always the same. So we need, this is why I agree with Roger on the importance of gathering with other patient representatives or with other patient organizations, because we have to be more than one around the table to discuss with these people and to change the mindset in the future.
Estelle,
yes.
One last point. I think it's about time, but there was in the chat. Sorrel Bickley had a good point regarding my presentation.
Yes.
She said it would be a pity if we would lose all the information about the advocacy topics and the request for information. And actually, I would like to, I forgot to mention that, but we are also planning to include the topics for advocacy in the priority setting questionnaire, the next step. So the research question as well as the advocacy topics, because it is very important to have their priority list as well. Information, I think, is another point, but we will obviously we will share that with all our members so that the different patient organizations can address the requests for information as well.
Okay. Any other questions? So thank you for your brilliant presentations. I think we are maybe out of time already. Thank you, Ornel.
Thank you, Estelle. Thank you.
So let's enjoy your coffee break and see you in 30 minutes, 25 now.